Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 218, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/218. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about my latest article, which is entitled Pot Meat Kettle, America's Use of Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons. But before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Childeberg. I just got back from Childeberg. I'm exhausted. And before we went to Childeberg, I took my wife and kids to visit her in-laws in Utah. And then I just left early and went to Childeberg. And then now I'm home and they're going to come back a little bit later. So I have the week to myself. And I think that means that I have to do all the projects around the house that I wouldn't otherwise have time to do. So I'm a bachelor for the week, but there's a lot of stuff still going on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Childeberg first, and then talk a bit about some changes with the show. I left Substack and I deleted my Substack account and switched over to the new platform. So I wanted to give everyone a little tour of that and then get into the article kind of in the later half of the show. So if you want to skip ahead just to get to the article, I completely understand. But there's a lot of stuff going on that I wanted to share with you guys as it pertains to my articles and the work that I've been doing for the Institute and other outlets that have been picking up my articles, which I'm incredibly excited about and is really, really an honor and very awesome. So, yep, Childeberg, just to talk about that, had a great time. I came to Childeberg on Thursday night, flew in at like midnight, and met Adam. Shout out to Adam. And the first night the code didn't work for our Airbnb, and then we were going to head out on Friday to the actual campground, but we had to we were going to pick up Rachel Tobias and her boyfriend Jason from the airport. Some of you might know Rachel. She was on Pete Quinonez's show, I think a couple weeks ago, maybe a week ago. So we got to Childeberg, got to hang out with all of the great folks there, Bird and Carr from Timeline Earth, and Ace Archist, and Nick Ashley, and so many other people that I'm leaving out probably. Eric from Rebel with the Cause, also Garbage Main, Andy, and had a great time. Just had a wonderful time at Childeberg. Spent a lot of time in the sun. Got to hang out with Tommy Salmons. Also got to meet Pete Quinonez for the first time. Got to meet Buck Johnson and Matt Erickson. And I'm trying to think of some other people. Just said hi briefly to Robbie the Fire and talked to Kyle Ruff for a little bit. Kyle was a comedian that does shows with Robbie, and they had just gotten back from Reno. So I was also in touch with Kyle Anzalone because Kyle was at the Reno reset, and it was kind of a tough decision, but I'm a Childebergian, and I think that going to Childeberg is something that I did last year, and while I support the Mises Caucus, I don't know, I had already committed to go to Childeberg beforehand, so the arrangements had all kind of been made, and unfortunately I can't clone myself and be in two places at once, so Childeberg it was, and got to hang out, like I said, got a lot of sun, avoided getting sunburnt, but I don't know if you can tell with the lighting, for those of you watching the video version, how dark I am. But I got back home, let's see, yesterday afternoon, and then I did some work around the house, and I found a baby fawn. I went to go get gas for my lawnmower, and this doe jumped out in front of me, and she had a fawn with her that seemed like it was like just a week or two old. Definitely was just born not too long ago, and they got separated. So I wouldn't have touched the fawn, because what you're supposed to do is just leave the fawn in where it is. If the fawn and the doe get separated, the doe will come back and find the fawn, and the fawn instinctually will just hunker down in like a bush or something like that. But the problem is that the fawn got spooked by another car, and it went into the ditch, and it got covered. At the bottom of the ditch there was standing water, and it was just crouching in the water, and I didn't want it to get hit by a car again to try and go up on the road. So I went in and I grabbed up the fawn, and I was kind of walking around with it trying to see if I could find the mother, and I just eventually kind of put it back in a bush after I couldn't find the mom, pretty much where they got separated, because I knew that mom would come back. So I put the the fawn back in the bush, and then I went away for a few hours, and I came back at dusk, and the fawn was not there anymore. And the fawn also wasn't dead on the side of the road, so I assume that the doe came back and picked it up. But for those of you who care really a lot about my my exploits when it comes to the fawn, I put a picture on Twitter, which isn't the most flattering picture of me, but here's the picture of me with the baby fawn, and it looks like it's all covered in water, right? Because it was covered in water because it was in the ditch. So yeah, interesting thing. I wasn't, in a sense, I wasn't not going to pick up the baby fawn, because who in their life has had a chance to hold a baby deer in their hands? So it was a pretty cool experience that I had upon coming back from Childerberg. So to put kind of an end note on that, shout out to everybody at Childerberg. It was real great to be with you, to hang out. I saw a whole bunch of people that I really care about a lot. The Jared and Will from Peaceful Treason, always looking forward to see you guys. Rollo from Rollo and Slappy Show, had a great conversation. Just so many people, wonderful experience. Always so recharges your batteries, even though I'm exhausted, but it recharges your batteries towards doing liberty activism, and really realizing that the fellowship that we have as a movement, despite all the infighting and things that happen, is that when you get together in person, it really is different, and you communicate these ideas, and there's no misunderstanding, and there's no flexing for social media or anything like that. And it was really great. Like I said, to meet Pete and Buck Johnson and Matt Erickson in person was a great experience, and I'm really glad that I got the chance to do that. And of course, I spent a bunch of time with Tommy Salmons, my brother, at the Libertarian Institute, and it's always special to see Tommy, and I consider him and the other guys to be kind of like a family that we have. So really special experience to do that. All right, so now that we've recapped Childerberg a bit, I wanted to make some announcements about moving over from Substack and deleting my Substack account and starting libertyweekly.club is the address, the URL. So this is where all my Substack writing is. This is a website that has all the functionality of Substack. I post my bonus content here. It goes out in a newsletter, an email, just like Substack does. So you go to the website and you hit subscribe, and then you get an option here to subscribe to the free version, which gets you access to all the public posts and a free digital copy of my forthcoming book that I would have wanted to release with the launching of this website. But alas, I ran out of time and couldn't finish the manuscript, and I was getting a little pressure from Ghost to swap over because they have a migration service. So Ghost is the platform that is kind of like Substack except open source, and they help you migrate over. But here, I'm developing tiers just like Patreon, but the tier that I have now is just what the price of Substack was, $55 a year, or you can subscribe for $5 per month, and it will get you all the lower tier benefits, early access to episodes, access to bonus episodes, which will come out at least twice a month, preprints of my articles for the Institute, and I am planning to do a subscribers-only live stream, which would be the third Thursday of every month at 8 p.m. Central, and I'd like to do that. The first one I think I'm going to be doing this month in June. Just got to check and look at the calendar and see what that looks like. June 23rd, it's a Thursday. Yeah, I can't do June 23rd. Damn it. That's my son's birthday. So I'll have to switch it up. I'll make an announcement about that probably on the next episode of the podcast, either June 30th or June 16th. I'll do the first live stream. But that will be for supporters at the $5 a month level. So if you want to head on over to libertyweekly.club, you can sign up and get access to all that. But you can see that the entire archive is already up there on the site. Everything is all ported over, and you just go to libertyweekly.club and hit the subscribe button there. and you get access to that. So the other thing I wanted to announce was that I had my article appear on the Future of Freedom Foundation website, and I think that's Jacob Hornberger's foundation over at Future of Freedom. So you can see here, I tweeted about it. My article, America's, that we're going to be reviewing today, America's Use of Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons, was up on the Future of Freedom Foundation. It also ran at antiwar.com, which every time that happens, it still makes my day. It's happened a bit, but it's so special, and it's such an honor, again, to be on antiwar.com, just a legendary anti-war and libertarian website there. I also received notice that my articles had been picked up by globalresearch.ca or globalresearch.org. And I believe, I don't know quite as much about Global Research. I'm familiar with their work because Professor Michelle Chossudovsky has appeared on the Corbett Report, and James Corbett has collaborated with Michelle Chossudovsky in the way of having him on for his episodes, for Corbett's documentary episodes. So let's see, if we go to the About page, it's a independent research and media organization based in Montreal. It's a nonprofit, Quebec nonprofit. And there's a whole bunch more information there that I don't think we have time to get into. So head on over to globalresearch.ca, and my author page is globalresearch.ca/author/Patrick-McFarlane. And you can see that my articles have actually been posted on there since the first one appeared in August 2021. But they reached out to me and sent me an email just to make sure that I knew that this archive existed. Maybe they just created this archive. But I think it's great. I'm really excited that my work is being put up on globalresearch.ca and shared at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And I would urge everyone that if you are a listener of the podcast and have been a listener for a long time, but you haven't been reading my articles that I've been putting out, it's kind of where I've been focusing my efforts. It's been getting a lot of attention in Steam, and I think that if you enjoy the documentary research content that I do here, these articles are a treasure trove for you, because I put a whole lot of links in the text itself, and you can go down rabbit holes and find all that. But moreover, I think that you would enjoy my coverage of these issues and making editorial points. And so if you want to head over to libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick, or again, the best, most intimate access for you to get that on early, you would get it early because I run the preprints at libertyweekly.club. So head on over there. Also, my work has been appearing at Zero Hedge. I had a couple articles appear on Zero Hedge at zerohedge.com. So I don't have the link up in front of me at the moment, but I think that's also been really special for me because Zero Hedge is such a big website. And it's something that a lot of people read. And moreover, the company that I'm keeping on those websites, like I said, Kyle Anzalone is being run there with Will Porter, and Connor Freeman is being run there as well occasionally. And so, again, just really special. Wanted to share with you guys that the work that I'm doing is being picked up by these outlets. So, without further ado, I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Let's head on over to my latest article, Pot Meat Kettle, Americans' Use of Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons. And what really kind of keyed me onto this topic is because Adam Kinzinger, in my article that I did, my expose on Adam Kinzinger's involvement in Ukrainian policy and his involvement with these neoconservative think tanks, I think that, he introduced this AUMF, and right now, it hasn't gotten traction in the Senate, in the House. It hasn't gotten any co-sponsors or anything like that. But I thought it was really alarming because, of course, it would allow Joe Biden to commit the United States to war, put boots on the ground in Ukraine if Russia were to use chemical, nuclear, or biological weapons. And I make that point in my article because I say, in a recent editorial, I discussed a new authorization for use of military force that was introduced in the U.S. House on May 1st, 2022 by Adam Kinzinger. The proposed AUMF, if passed, would allow Joe Biden to deploy American forces to restore, quote, the territorial integrity of Ukraine in the event that Russia uses chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. And I wrote, thankfully, as antiwar.com news editor Dave DeCamp writes, Kinzinger's AUMF has failed to gain traction. This may seem like a bright spot in an otherwise apocalyptically bad news cycle, but not to worry. Antiwar.com opinion editor Kyle Anzalone noted in his recent interview of me, Kinzinger's proposed AUMF will likely sit on the House floor until the necessary political capital appears to have it pass. So I also do this thing where I'm really bad at promoting when I have a guest interview. But here's the episode that I appeared. Kyle posted it at antiwar.com. The episode where we discuss in detail my articles about Lindsey Graham and Adam Kinzinger. And it's pretty in-depth that we go into that. So if you want to hear my further editorializations on my editorials, head on over to, I'll put this in the show notes page, my recent appearance on Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone. So Kyle noted, yeah, it'll likely sit on the House floor until the necessary political capital appears, which it will appear when Russia, or anyone really, uses chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. So again, we have this situation that's very similar to what happened in Syria when we had the Syrian gas attacks, or the alleged Syrian gas attacks, where the entire mainstream media was saying that Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons and gassed his own people. And like I said, in one of my favorite appearances of my favorite Thomas Massey moments is when he goes on CNN and says that he doesn't believe that Assad would gas his own people, and the CNN anchor is just flabbergasted. I'm going to pull that up. Okay, so here we have Thomas Massey's appearance on CNN, and I don't recall what the date was exactly, but I remember seeing it within a day or two of it happening. And it was years ago, back when Assad was being accused of gassing his own people. I don't know if it was Duma or another incident, but Thomas Massey basically says, well, it wouldn't make any sense for Assad to gas his own people, because essentially the Obama administration had already said that that was a red line. And if any chemical attacks were committed in Syria, then that would be a reason for the broader, for broader U.S. involvement in Syria. And it doesn't make sense. Assad is, on the cusp of winning the war, and it just doesn't make sense that he would do that. And moreover, by Obama announcing that the United States wouldn't tolerate any kind of gas or chemical attack, that actually just gives incentive to the rebels to fake a gas attack to get the United States further involved in the conflict. So that was kind of an idea that I had with this article. But I wanted to show how hypocritical the United States is. But let's revisit this Massey clip, because it's my favorite Massey moment.
It's hard to know exactly what's happening in Syria right now. I'd like to know specifically how that release of chemical gas, if it did occur, and it looks like it did, how that occurred. Because frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It does not serve his interests.
Look at her eyes.
It would tend to draw us into that civil war even further.
Who do you think is behind it? Who do you think is behind it?
She has no idea what to say.
You've got a war going on over there. Supposedly that airstrike was on an ammo dump. And so I don't know if it was released because there was gas stored in the ammo dump or not. That's plausible. I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but
You're more inclined to believe the position of what Bashar al-Assad is saying and what the Russians are saying right now than more inclined to believe what even your colleagues here in the United States believe is truth, that this is Assad, and what human rights observers over there say is Assad?
I don't think it would have served Assad's purposes to do a chemical attack on his people. So it's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did.
Congressman Tom Massey, thanks for your time.
And it's all, I mean, of course, it's all an act that she's doing. It's not that she really doesn't know what to say. It's just that she, she's playing a role and she wants to discredit Thomas Massey by acting flabbergasted and aghast that he would, not rush to conclusions about something that, an emerging situation where the facts are just not clear on the ground and, in the general rush to war. So, I think that's, incredibly related to what's happening right now in Russia because you have kind of a similar situation. And then I continue, although Kinzinger's proposed AUMF asserts the moral high ground by threatening war against Russia, it can claim none. The United States can't claim the moral high ground even though it asserts it, because the U.S. has deployed all three types of weapons in its against its enemies in the recent past and further back in U.S. history. So, of course, the first example we have is that the United States is the only country in world history to have used nuclear weapons against an enemy during wartime. And this is, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. Just anecdotally, we have evidence that there were high members of the U.S. military that were against the use of the atomic bombs at the end of World War II. And I believe that Scott Horton did a piece on antiwar.com about this. Yeah, so you can see this piece here. I'll put in the show notes page. Scott Horton wrote June 5th of 2021. Holy crap, that was almost a year ago already. Who opposed nuking Japan? Talking about General Dwight D. Eisenhower saying, quote, "The Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing." So I would, here's a whole bunch of quotes that Scott Horton compiled about the unnecessary use of nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. I'll just read a couple of them. Let's see. Herbert Hoover says, quote, "The use of the atomic bomb with its indiscriminate killing of women and children revolts my soul." Quote, "The Japanese were prepared to negotiate all the way from February 1945 up to and before the time the atomic bombs were dropped. If such leads had been followed up, there would have been no occasion to drop the bombs." Let's see. Dwight D. Eisenhower says, "In 1945, Secretary of War Stimson, visiting my headquarters in Germany, informed me that our government was preparing to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. I was one of those who felt that there were a number of cogent reasons to question the wisdom of such an act. The secretary, upon giving me the news of the successful bomb test in New Mexico and of the plan for using it, asked for my reaction, apparently expecting a vigorous assent. During his recitation of the relevant facts, I had been conscious of a feeling of depression, and so I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. It was my belief that Japan was, at that very moment, seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. The secretary was deeply perturbed by my attitude." Can you imagine that? Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the saviors, one of the American heroes in World War II, expressing displeasure at the use of the atomic bomb to the horror of the Secretary of War. So I thought that was really interesting. So, of course, I cited that. But, of course, the atomic bombs overwhelmingly killed civilians. And I cite another antiwar.com piece by Richard White. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. So, just an abhorrent act. Here, this is short enough to read. Why we, in quotes, really nuked both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in just 3 days. Oliver Stone, this is a quote, "Every school kid, still my daughter in her school and private school in a good school, is learning this. We dropped the bomb because we had to, because the Japanese resistance was fanatic and we would have lost many American lives taking Japan. This is one, there's no alternative to that story. Here's the alternative, a part of the truth that should be taught in good, honest schools," according to L. Richard White. At 8:16 on the morning of August 6, 1945, the world got a glimpse of its own mortality. At that moment, the city of Hiroshima was obliterated by a fireball that sent waves of searing heat, then a deafening concussion across the landscape. 3 days later, a second bomb hit Nagasaki. Eisenhower said in 1963, quote, "It wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing." Besides the Manhattan Project's internal momentum was an external motive. Its leaders had to justify the $2 billion, $26 billion in today's dollars, expense to Congress and the public. Burns warned Roosevelt that political scandal would follow if the atomic bomb was not used. How would you get Congress to appropriate money for atomic research after the war if you do not show results for the money which was spent already? The U.S. had produced two types of bombs, one using uranium, the other plutonium. Whenever anyone suggested that the moment the bomb was dropped, the war would be over, bureaucrat Groves countered, quote, "Not until we drop two bombs on Japan." As historian Goldberg explains, quote, "One bomb justified Oak Ridge, the second justified Hanford. Hiroshima was hit with the uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was used against Nagasaki." That's from Why We Dropped the Bomb by William Lanoet. It's hard for Americans who identify with the U.S. government to accept the idea that that organization could have engaged in such horrendous acts twice in 3 days without pristine motives. Here's what Vietnam-era U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who was part of General Curtis LeMay's command when the bombs were dropped, thought about it. McNamara said, quote, "He, General Curtis LeMay, and I'd say were behaving as war criminals." So you get kind of a candid admission from McNamara that they were war criminals for dropping the bombs. So then I also wanted to say that, this is small potatoes compared to actually dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. But the test detonations themselves exposed U.S. citizens to dangerous levels of radiation. And I quoted the Manhattan Project, OSTI.gov, talking about the Trinity test. And one thing that I found was really interesting, I've studied this before in a documentary that I never ended up releasing, but how the Manhattan Project scientists exposed U.S. citizens to dangerous levels of radiation without their consent or knowledge by injecting them with plutonium during the Manhattan Project and after the Manhattan Project even. So let's see. Prior to the Trinity test, scientists were well aware that the blast would create potential radiation hazards. After all, even basic laboratory or factory work created significant radiation safety issues. In the case of an explosion, plutonium in the device would fission into other radionuclides. Neutrons would strike various elements on the ground and turn some into radioactive isotopes. This radioactive debris would be swept with fission products into a growing fireball and lifted high into the air. Once in the atmosphere, a cloud of intense radioactivity would form. Immediate radiation from the explosion and residual radioactive debris initially caused little concern because of dilution in the air and the isolation of the site. But as the test drew closer, planners realized with some sense of urgency that radioactive fallout over local towns posed a real hazard. Leslie Groves in particular feared legal culpability if things got out of hand. As a result, Army intelligence agents located and mapped everyone within a 40-mile radius. Test planners set up elaborate off-site monitoring systems and prepared evacuation plans if exposure levels became too high. However, the test was more efficient than expected, and little fallout initially dropped in the test site beyond 1,200 yards of ground zero. Yada yada. Most radioactivity was contained within the dense white mushroom cloud that topped out at 25,000 feet. Within an hour, the cloud had largely dispersed toward the northeast, all the while dropping a trail of fission products. Off-site fallout was heavy. Several ranch families missed by the Army survey received significant exposures in the 2 weeks following Trinity. The families nonetheless evidenced little external injury. Okay, well that doesn't mean that they weren't affected and didn't receive dangerous levels of radiation. They just didn't show it externally. But the article continues, livestock were not as fortunate, suffering skin burns, bleeding, and loss of hair. Stafford Warren, the Manhattan District's chief medical officer, reported to Groves that, quote, while no house area investigated received a dangerous amount, the dust outfall from the various portions of the cloud was potentially a very dangerous hazard over a band almost 30 miles wide, extending almost 90 miles northeast to the site. So, yeah, and there was another thing here, too. It was stated that, here, Los Alamos scientists had even discussed the possibility that the atmosphere itself might be ignited and the entire Earth annihilated at the Trinity test, but dismissed this as an unlikely possibility. I mean, can you believe that? Can you believe that some of the scientists thought they might ignite the atmosphere of the Earth, and that they might end all life on this planet, and that there was a possibility of it, albeit unlikely, but there was still a possibility of it, and they were willing to roll the dice anyways. And it's kind of like the Castle Bravo test, which was the first hydrogen bomb test that occurred. And in that test, too, I'm reading a book that I'm going to quote from here in a little bit when we talk about Agent Orange, but it's called The Pentagon's Brain, an uncensored history of DARPA, America's top secret military research agency. And there is an endorsement on the back from the Washington Post and the Boston Globe and Amazon. So I don't know if this is a limited hangout of sorts, because you know how connected the Washington Post is to the CIA with the Amazon cloud computing stuff. So, but yeah, so even in Castle Bravo and in the Trinity test, they thought that there was a chance that they would completely obliterate all life on this planet, that it was a possibility, although unlikely, but let's do it anyways. So, okay, so let's go to this, back to the article. I said, in tune with their character between 1945 and 1947, Manhattan Project scientists purposefully injected 30 Americans with plutonium just to see what would happen. These injections were administered without the subject's knowledge or consent. And I linked to the Atomic Heritage Foundation here, talking about all of these scientists. And I've done, I think for bonus content, I went through the documentary that I was preparing to release but never finished, because it was a several-part endeavor there. But these are the doctors that were involved: Robert S. Stone, Stafford Leake Warren, Wright Langham, Lewis Hempelman, Joseph G. Hamilton was one of the worst. And if you go through this, you can, through my article, you can read about the human radiation experiments. Here's a quote. There was a congressional inquest into this in the 90s, oddly enough spearheaded by the Clinton administration. But here's a quote from the Atomic Heritage website. Quote, although these experiments did provide information on the retention and absorption of radioactive material by the human body, the experiments are nonetheless repugnant because human subjects were essentially used as guinea pigs and calibration devices. And that's a quote from a congressional subcommittee. So you can see some of the pictures here in the video version. Wright Langham and the secrecy of this. Joseph Hamilton drinking radioactive sodium at, I believe that was at the UC Berkeley campus. So the subjects here, it is most likely that the 30 experimental subjects were not made aware of the nature of the injections they received. In fact, records show that only one of the plutonium patients signed a consent form, which did not fully explain the medical procedure or risks. There is no documentation of any consent for any further test subjects. Furthermore, it is difficult to say how the specific patients involved were chosen. The injections were performed in hospitals around the country. The ages and backgrounds of each varied. Some had family and others were alone. Regardless, the records show that they were all civilians and were not themselves Manhattan Project workers. In order to understand the troubling nature of this research, it is important to highlight the stories of some of these test subjects. So here's the Oak Ridge Hospital, which was one place where it happened. Eb Cade was the first test subject. Cade was a 53-year-old African-American male who worked for an Oak Ridge construction company as a cement mixer. On March 24th, 1945, he was involved in an auto accident, which caused fractures in his arm and leg. Documents from the time show that he was otherwise healthy. Over the next 2 weeks, he was given the code name HP-12, with HP standing for human product. Yeah. Human product. Dr. Friedel wrote to Dr. Hempelman at Los Alamos that he had found a primary subject for the plutonium experiment. On April 10th, 1945, Dr. Joseph Howland administered a plutonium dose of 4.7 micrograms to Cade, who was awaiting a procedure to set his bones. From 1943 to 1945, the maximum possible body burden for plutonium had been 5 micrograms, based on limits adopted for radium. Based on animal experimentation, Langham and Friedel had recently concluded that because plutonium remained in the bone for longer than radium, the MPBB, the maximum possible body burden, should actually be set at 1 microgram. Cade's dose was nearly 5 times that limit. Let's see. Cade was not treated for his arm and leg injuries until April 15th, 5 days after the injection, so that the doctors would be able to biopsy his bone samples. This included extracting 15 of his teeth, which were subsequently shipped to Wright Langham at Los Alamos. It is unclear if Cade suffered from legitimate tooth decay. Shortly after his bones had been set, Cade suddenly discharged himself from the hospital. He moved out of Tennessee and died of heart failure on April 1953, 8 years after the Oak Ridge injection. So how horrific is that? So I'm not going to go through every example that's listed on this article of people who, the test subjects who received injections without their consent. So yeah, this is the United States, the Manhattan Project, admonishing other countries for their treatment or potential use of nuclear weapons. So there you have it. Look at our own nuclear weapons program. And that doesn't even include the test sites, the further tests that included in the United States and the test sites out in the Pacific, which were horribly destroyed, these atolls out in the Pacific, and I believe had incredible effects on local populations in some of these test areas. So, all right, well, next we turn to biological warfare. And the U.S. military has tested biological weapons against its own citizens on several occasions. So one of these I've talked about before on the show, and I won't go in depth into, but I'll give you the link to where I talked about it. But I talked about the zinc cadmium sulfide dispersal experiments that occurred in St. Louis primarily, but 30 other, I think it was 30 other towns and cities in the American Midwest and in Canada that had this zinc cadmium sulfide that was sprayed in the air. And that I covered that article I wrote about that in a bonus episode called something about Return of the Living Dead, and that turned into my most popular episode of all time. There's like thousands of downloads of that one, and I thought it was funny because it was kind of a one-off episode, a bonus episode that I made. So, but I talked about a different episode, a different biological experiment in this article. And that is Operation Sea Spray. Before Operation Sea Spray, I talked about in 1949, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps secretly released a harmless bacteria into the Pentagon's air conditioning system just to see how it spread through the building, which I thought was crazy because, I mean, what if you made a mistake, or if the bacteria was able to mutate and turn into something virulent and you just basically destroyed the entire Pentagon? It's crazy. I mean, what the hell? So, and then in April of 1950 and September of 1950, so April and September of 1950, the Army Chemical Corps sprayed the coasts of Norfolk, Virginia, and San Francisco, California, respectively, with 2 types of bacteria. The types of bacteria that were released, Bacillus globigi and Serratia marcescens, were believed to be harmless at the time. However, it turns out that Bacillus globigi is now considered to be a pathogen. It causes food poisoning and can hurt anyone with a weak immune system. As for Serratia marcescens, 11 people were admitted to a hospital with serious bacterial infections after the San Francisco test. And one of them, a gentleman named Edward Nevin, died 3 weeks later after the test. So I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know if I had heard of Operation Sea Spray before, but I thought it was really interesting. Here's an article by the Smithsonian Magazine by Helen Thompson, written in 2015. It says, the title is, in 1950, the U.S. released a bioweapon in San Francisco. This was one of hundreds of bioweapons simulations carried out in the 50s and 60s. And it also links to another episode, or another article by Discover Magazine. And here's a picture in this about, in Discover Magazine, these bacteria, the Serratia bacteria, growing on some bread. It's bright red in color. And the government, let's see, I'll just read through this because it's well, not this whole article. It's pretty long. They talk about the Nuremberg Code and how the United States was violating the Nuremberg Code soon after, 4 years after. It sprayed the city of San Francisco with a microbe, Serratia marcescens, in a simulated germ warfare attack. The genus Serratia are a group of soil and water-dwelling microbes with one very neat party trick: the manufacture of a red pigment known as prodigiosin, derived from the Latin prodigiosus for its marvelous and seemingly supernatural coloring. This color ranges from a lurid vermilion to a washed-out pink depending on the microbe's age. This unique property has been regularly exploited in microbiology as a biological marker, tracking metabolic behavior and transmission of bacteria in various environments. For this reason, the microbe is an ideal tool for such work, a showy microbe that naturally flies a very noticeable red flag. Let's see, So this pigment production was exploited by the U.S. military amidst the cooling atmosphere of Soviet-American relations in the 1950s. The flashy Serratia marcescens was used as the model organism in a simulated germ warfare attack known as Operation Sea Spray. The goal, quote, a vulnerability test to identify susceptible regions in the event of a biological terrorist attack. San Francisco was chosen for its unique geography and proximity to the ocean, as well as its dense population and the tall buildings present throughout its downtown. Over a period of 6 days in September 1950, members of the U.S. Navy sprayed clouds of Serratia from giant hoses aboard a Navy minesweeper drifting 2 miles along the San Francisco coastline. A bacterial fog quickly enveloped and disguised by the region's own mist. Oh, that's sinister. By monitoring the air at 43 scattered sites through the region, the Navy found Serratia bacteria blown throughout San Francisco and extending to the adjacent communities of Albany, Berkeley, Daly City, Colma, Oakland, San Leandro, and Sausalito. In this regard, the experiment was a success. The San Francisco Bay was identified as a highly susceptible site for a germ warfare attack, and a quantifiable range for the airborne dispersal of microbes was established. In 1951, a 1951 military report on the experiment summarized the findings. Quote, it was noted that a successful biological warfare attack on this area can be launched from the sea, and that effective dosages can be produced over relatively large areas. It was estimated that each of the city's 800,000 residents received a heavy dose of Serratia, inhaling millions of bacteria through the testing period. In its report, the military further concluded that Serratia marcescens is so rare a cause of illness, and the illness resulting is predominantly so trivial that its use as a simulant should be continued even over populated areas. However, Suratia can cause illness, and the repercussions of this experiment extended far beyond a slightly foggier week for San Franciscans. A week after the spraying, 11 patients were admitted to the now-defunct Stanford University Hospital in San Francisco with severe urinary tract infections resistant to the limited antibiotics available in that era. One gentleman recovering from prostate surgery developed complications of heart infections as Suratia colonized his heart valves. This would be the only death during the aftermath of the experiment. Stanford University Hospital doctors cultured the patient's urine on petri dishes, found an unusual and unexpected discovery that microbes were blushing with a cherry red pigment. So, really interesting. Regardless, I mean, okay, it does appear, to be fair, that the Suratia, it turned out to be relatively harmless. It appears, even though 11 people were hospitalized and one person died. All this was conducted without informed consent, so it violates the Geneva Convention. But moreover, I mean, that's just a convention. But this is sinister, very sinister, and is not ethical or moral. Okay, so I also talked about how the United States provided biological weapons to Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. And to support that, I have this article snapshotted from the Baltimore Sun talking about how Iraq's biological weapons program came from the United States, from the CDC of all people. And I talked about how, let's see, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention sent samples directly to several Iraqi sites that UN weapons inspectors determined were part of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. CDC and congressional records from the early 1990s show this. Iraq had ordered the samples, claiming it needed them for legitimate medical research. The CDC and a biological sample company, American Type Culture Collection, sent strains of all the germs Iraq used to make weapons, including anthrax, the bacteria that made botulinum toxin. Okay, let's start that over. The CDC and a biological sample company, American Type Culture Collection, sent strains of all the germs Iraq used to make weapons, including anthrax, the bacteria that make botulinum toxin, and the germs that cause gas gangrene, the records show. Iraq also got samples of other deadly pathogens, including West Nile virus. The transfers came in the 1980s when the U.S. supported Iraq in its war with Iran. They were detailed in a 1994 Senate Banking Committee report and a 1995 follow-up letter from the CDC to the Senate. The exports were legal at the time and approved under a program administered by the Commerce Department. Let's see. This is a quote. I don't think it would be accurate to say the U.S. government deliberately provided seed stocks to the Iraqis' biological weapons program, said Jonathan Tucker, a former UN biological weapons inspector. Quote, but they did deliver samples that Iraq said had a legitimate public health purpose, which I think was naive to believe even at the time. And of course, that comes at a time that the United States is openly supporting Saddam Hussein. And, I'd be remiss not to mention Iran-Contra, the scandal that proved that the United States indeed was supporting both sides of the Iraq-Iran war. So here's the National Security Archive documenting Iran-Contra. So I linked to that as well. And I guess to go a little bit deeper into that article, the Baltimore Sun article, there was a senator, I believe, that confronted Donald Rumsfeld about it at a hearing. The disclosures put the U.S. in the uncomfortable position of possibly having provided the key ingredients of the weapons America is considering waging war to destroy, said Robert C. Byrd. This Baltimore Sun article is from 2002. The West Virginia Democrat entered the documents into the congressional record this month. Byrd asked Defense Secretary Rumsfeld about the germ transfers at a recent Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Byrd noted that Rumsfeld met Saddam Hussein in 1983 when Rumsfeld was President Reagan's Middle East envoy. The senator said, quote, are we, in fact, Now facing the possibility of reaping what we have sown, Byrd asked Rumsfeld after reading parts of a Newsweek article on the transfers. Quote, I have never heard anything like what you've read. I have no knowledge of it whatsoever, and I doubt it, Rumsfeld said. He later said he would ask the Defense Department and other government agencies to search their records for evidence of the transfers. Invoices included in the documents read like shopping lists for biological weapons programs. One 1986 shipment from the Virginia-based American-type culture collection included 3 strains of anthrax, 6 strains of the bacteria that make botulinum toxide, and 3 strains of the bacteria that cause gas gangrene. Iraq later admitted to the United Nations that it had made weapons out of all 3. The company sent the bacteria to the University of Baghdad, which UN inspectors concluded had been used as a front to acquire samples for Iraq's biological weapons program. The CDC, meanwhile, sent shipments of germs to the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission and other agencies involved in Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs. Now, of course, I'm not quite as up on the role that the UN inspectors had to play in investigating Iraq before the United States invasion. So I think this proves that the CDC records do exist. However, I don't know if... I would just be cautious about the assertions from the UN inspectors. And there's other people like Scott Horton who have done a lot more work on specifically that issue than I have. So go in and research exactly. I'm sure it's in Fool's Errand, or it's in enough already, I'm sure. I think I remember reading more about the UN inspectors and what role they played in their reliability and their veracity. However, I thought that was really interesting because these are documented on the congressional record, these CDC documents of these transfers. So I think that, of course, this whole article is about the United States playing the pot calling the kettle black. So I talk a little bit about white phosphorus as well, and the United States using white phosphorus in the Second Battle of Fallujah during Iraq, and that there's evidence that the United States has used white phosphorus to fight ISIS in Syria and Iraq more recently than the Second Battle of Fallujah. There's also evidence that during, of course, the whole story of the Second Battle of Fallujah is that the insurgency, that the United States had cleared out the city and that most of the civilians had left, or at least ostensibly so. And if you want to hear more about the Second Battle of Fallujah, I did interview our friend Scott Spalding about his experience on the ground during the Second Battle of Fallujah. And I think that he also appeared on an interview with Shane Hazel and maybe Adam Kokesh, who was there as well. They all fought in the Second Battle of Fallujah, as I recall. And I'll try and put it in the show notes page, but if you go to libertyweekly.net and search Scott Spalding, Spaulding, you should find the episode 177, libertyweekly.net/177, talking about his experience in the Second Battle of Fallujah. I didn't ask him about white phosphorus or anything like that, but the understanding was, as I recall, that the city was to be cleared of civilians, even though it wasn't completely cleared, but that they did employ white phosphorus on what they said were insurgents. And there is an Italian documentarian who claims that the white phosphorus did in fact harm civilians. And for those of you who don't know, white phosphorus is a chemical compound that burns intensely when exposed to oxygen. When it comes into contact with the human body, it burns to the bone because you can't put it out. And the only way to put it out, or try to, is to cover it with dirt. And so once it sticks to your body, it just burns and burns and burns right through. And my dad is a former fireman, and he would do these outdoor festivals. They would contract with local fire departments to provide state, coverage and safety during these festivals. And he said one year there were some idiots who took a brick of phosphorus and put it on their campfire. And he said it was a huge, like a conflagration because the phosphorus caught on fire and they couldn't put it out. Like you can't put it out with water or anything. So they had to try and bury the phosphorus, bury the campfire and just keep throwing dirt on it and dirt on it. And it ignites and creates this white smoke that is pretty unmistakable. You can see here, there's a picture in my article of the white phosphorus. So for the point, Human Rights Watch claims that the United States use white phosphorus against civilians, or at least that the white phosphorus incidentally harmed civilians. However, in the article that I read, they couldn't confirm allegations and video footage from Iraq and Syria that white phosphorus had harmed civilians. But they did note that allegations exist and are supported by at least some video evidence. Furthermore, U.S. partners Israel and Turkey have been accused of using white phosphorus, and Israel even admitted to the use of white phosphorus, but of course always with the distinction that they didn't use it against civilians, or at least didn't intend to. But every time you use white phosphorus, there is a risk that you would harm civilians because of, the indiscriminate nature of modern warfare, not really being able to pick your targets. And of course, in my research, I did find that some people are accusing Russia of using white phosphorus in Ukraine because, of course. And I linked to a lawfare blog. There's a legal military blog called Lawfare, and I think it's more not exactly in our anti-war persuasion, but they were defending the use of white phosphorus, or at least defending the legality of using white phosphorus. And I thought that was interesting. So then I talk about Agent Orange, and I was going to read a quote from the book, but we're really kind of running up against time here. The book I had mentioned, The Pentagon's Brain, The Uncensored History of DARPA, but there's several passages in the book that explain exactly how Agent Orange was developed with the help of Monsanto, I believe, and what the purpose of it was to cut down on the it was supposed to be waging counterinsurgency warfare against the VC, the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And the point was to deny the VC, quote, protective cover from the jungle canopy. The second purpose was to starve the enemy, quote, by poisoning their primary food crop, a jungle root called manioc. And I thought in the book it was interesting that Lyndon B. Johnson's National Security Advisor, Walt Rostow, called the defoliant program, Agent Orange, quote, a type of chemical warfare. And over the course of the Vietnam War, the United States sprayed 19 million gallons of Agent Orange on Vietnam's jungles. Quote, a 2012 congressional report determined that over the course of the war, between 2.1 million and 4.8 million Vietnamese were directly exposed to Agent Orange. And of course, we've all heard a great deal of how U.S. soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange, and in fact, I've heard that Agent Orange was used around United States Army bases to get a clear line of sight for the base, and that's my understanding is that's where a lot of the exposure came from, is that they would release the Agent Orange and spray it, and I believe it was like a powder when they released it, that it was orange when it came out, but after it had sat on the ground, it turned to like a gray dust, and it killed everything, and they would spray it around the perimeter of the army bases to get a better line of sight so they could see attacks coming in. But there's a huge problem with Vietnam vets who were exposed to Agent Orange and myriad health conditions with internal organs. And I include some because I think it's often lost because people focus on the effects on U.S. soldiers of Agent Orange, but I think it's often lost the effect on the population, the Vietnamese population. So here's a couple quotes from studies that I pulled. Quote, 98 refugees who had been exposed to chemical sprays in South Vietnam were interviewed in Hanoi. Most reported effects on eyes and skin and gastrointestinal upsets. 92% suffered fatigue, prolonged or indefinite, and 17% 92% suffered fatigue, comma, prolonged or indefinite in 17% of cases. Reports of abortions and monstrous births in sprayed humans and animals, and of substantial numbers of deaths among fish, fowl, and pigs were also given. A 2006 meta-analysis found a very high correlation between exposure to Agent Orange and birth defects. Here's a quote from the study. Results. In total, 22 studies, including 13 Vietnamese and 9 non-Vietnamese studies, were identified. The summary relative risk of birth defects associated with exposure to Agent Orange was 1.95, with a 95% confidence interval, with a substantial heterogeneity across studies. So I researched what these words mean, and a relative risk is a measure of your risk relative to a normal human being. So my understanding is that if your relative risk is 1.95 with a 95 confidence interval, my understanding is that means that if you're exposed to Agent Orange, you are twice as likely to have birth defects. And that there was a 95% confidence interval, so they can say that with a high degree of confidence. I believe that's what that means. If any statisticians or chemists or scientists are out there and would like to tell me I'm wrong, please correct me. And you can Google this yourself for the listener. Vietnamese studies showed a higher summary relative risk, where the relative risk was 3. So they found that exposure means that you were 3 times more likely to have birth defects. Subgroup analyses found that the magnitude of association tended to increase with greater degrees of exposure to Agent Orange, rated on intensity and duration of exposure and dioxin concentrations measured in affected populations. The conclusion from the meta-analysis was, a meta-analysis is like it's a study of a whole bunch of different studies, so they synthesize the results across studies. The conclusion is that parental exposure to Agent Orange appears to be associated with an increased risk of birth defects. And I think there's another part about this dioxin concentrations amongst the population is that it's something that shows that you've been exposed to Agent Orange. So even, how many years has it been since the 1960s? It's been like 60 years, 50 years. If you're going from 1970 until 2022 is that's like 52 years. They're still finding dioxin concentrations in people who weren't even alive during Vietnam. So in conclusion, I just say the U.S. constantly grandstands about enforcing, quote, the international rules-based order. But what does that stand for? If the United States' own conduct is the measure, then it should have no quarrel with Russia for using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. So, all right, well, I hope that you enjoyed kind of this deeper dive on this article that I did, and thanks for sticking through the beginning, getting a little bit of updates from my Childeberg experience, but also heading on over to libertyweekly.club and signing up for the newsletter on the new platform. Really excited about it. I got a lot of things coming up. Like I said, I'm working on that book and getting that out for free subscribers. So if you want to get that, sign up. If you want to get a free ebook copy, I'll be doing probably PDF, EPUB, and the Kindle versions. I'll be sending that out to all free email subscribers when I get that done. And then if you subscribe at a $10 a month level, I'm going to be I'll be sending you a copy of my book that is signed, because I want to have physical copies too. So there will be other benefits. Like I said, I think $5 a month will get you on the call, or excuse me, $5 a month will get you to view this monthly call that I want to do starting this month, and $10 will get you on the call itself. So still figuring out how we're going to facilitate that, but I'm going to have to get those tier levels launched, which I'm looking to do really soon. So like I said, head on over to libertyweekly.club. You can get all that stuff and the bonuses. subscribe through the subscribe link in the lower right-hand corner. Then you'll sign up with your email address and you can log into the site to access the bonus content. Otherwise, you can just access it through the emails like you have been doing on Substack this whole time. Also, don't forget the Liberty Weekly podcast is a part of the Libertarian Institute. I'm the Justin Raimondo Fellow up over there, libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find the work of all my good buddies over there at the Institute, my colleagues there. And a reminder that we will be at Freedom Fest this year in Las Vegas. So if you want to go over, I think the promo code is Scott, and you can get a discount. But if you look at Freedom Fest in Vegas, the dates are July 13th through the 16th. And there will be a bunch of keynote speakers there. Like I said, most of the Libertarian Institute crew will be there. I believe most of the antiwar.com crew will be there, so you get to meet and hang out with us. I think that should be really exciting. But if you go to the website, here's Freedom Fest. Here are all the speakers. Let's see, Spike Cohen, Justin Amash, Del Bigtree, Glenn Greenwald, Maj Touré. I believe Dave Smith is going to be there too. Rand Paul will be there. Kennedy will be there from Fox Business. So John Cleese will be there. So I think that'll be really, really fun and interesting. And just reach out to me if you're planning on attending. So, all right, libertyweekly.club. Check it out. Other than that, we will see you next time. Peace.